Hey, what's up, YouTube? Well, I guess Merry Christmas from some douchebag in a muscle shirt. Um, yeah, this is nighttime Christmas. The tradition of my family is Christmas Eve stuff. We did things a little different, a little even earlier than that this year because some people not being around for the holidays. Long story short, I did all my Christmas stuff. All my Christmas was pretty much done yesterday. I pretty much didn't do nothing today but chill. And it's late. It's late evening time. So even if I had done something, it's like it would have been done by now. So I'm making in order to keep my stuff consistent, try and do this maybe once a week for a little bit. See what happens. See if I can keep that energy going. Yeah, making a short video. I started out making these videos in response to that guy Pete, who you just refused to invite to gatherings, and George's journal. So you might think, oh, am I going to be like manosphere? I really don't know. I find some of that stuff interesting, but there's kind of a mix of stuff I like about that stuff I'm, shall we say, on there's good and bad vibes about it. Obviously, the two guys I mentioned plus Stardust are like cool individuals, but there's also a lot of stuff in that I'm not 100% down with. I might touch on some Manosphere themes here and there, but this channel is just gonna be chaotic. I think kind of it's gonna be about stuff that interests me, stuff that I want to say. Which probably is a bad formula because you're supposed to have a brand and stick to, consistent topics most of the time. Well, if you want to be a real YouTuber, I'll probably never be a real YouTuber. So whatever. So today, what do I want to talk about? I talked about my genetics and some anthropology stuff, and I mentioned how I'm like kind of a history nerd. And I mentioned how I was and still am into like Scandinavian history. So what I want to talk to about today is just kind of a brief sort of little history lesson for just very basic. I'm a college dropout. I'm not qualified or certified, but just as a guy who's interested and studies things a little here and a little there, yada yada. These are some things that I want to talk about to sort of lay a little basic foundational knowledge about some Viking stuff and to clear up a few. A little itch in my eye there, shit. A few misconceptions that people have about the Vikings, who they were, where they were from, etc. So, without further ado, let's talk about it. So, first of all, when was the time of the Vikings? The time of the Vikings was approximately the 790s until the early 1100s, give or take, because there was some small scale Viking activity that was a little before the 790s, and some activity continued on after the early 1100s, but generally this slightly over 300-year period, 350-year period or so, is kind of the ballpark of what we're talking about when we're talking about the Viking era. So yeah, that's the time period. Now, what do we got here? Now the region. Okay, this one always kind of gets me that. So where were Vikings? Well, everybody knows Vikings are from Norway, right? But the thing is, it always surprises me that people don't know where else they're from. Like, oh, Norway, and then some people are like, oh, kind of as an afterthought, oh yeah, the Swedes are kind of like that, so probably Sweden too a little bit. It's like everybody knows Norway, but nobody knows. But not nobody knows, but it's most people know. But it never ceases to surprise me that some people don't know that they came from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. so many people forget Denmark, and and the reason that's kind of a big deal is because you can sort of divide the Viking era into three periods of time. The early Viking era was pretty much dominated by the Danes, and so yeah, you could say we don't know this 100% for sure, but the Danes probably basically invented what it is to be a Viking. The Danes are probably the OG Vikings. So that's important, and people sometimes sometimes confuse the Danish with the Dutch. It's like, oh yeah, the Danish, yeah, don't they wear like wooden shoes and and got like windmills all over? It's like no, there are a lot of interesting similarities and parallels between the Danes and the Dutch, and they're both very like. Naval seagoing kind of people, and the Dutch did have their own kind of Viking like thing earlier in history. So there's some interesting parallels, but and they're related, yeah. But the Danish are not the Dutch. Okay, the Dutch are not Scandinavians strictly, although, well, I could elaborate, but the Danes are Scandinavians, and the Danes were probably the OG Vikings, although that gets complicated too because we're talking about a time so far back in history that the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Swiss were kind of one people. There wasn't really clear boundaries per se between them. But yeah, so early Viking era, the Danes were the most dominant, the most well recorded, and in fact, when you paid a Viking to stop attacking you, or we paid a Viking tribe to when you bribed them to not raid your village, that was called Dane Guild, and it referred to all Vikings, but that just Dane from the very beginning was synonymous with Viking. And I think in America we associate them mostly with the Norwegians because we have a lot of Norwegian Americans. We don't have a lot of Danish Americans, so I think that's part of it. Yeah, the Norwegians are just more vocal about being proud of that aspect of their history, whereas Swedes and Danes both are a little bit more mellow about it. It seems just in not that's not always the case. Generalizing here a bit. That seems to be the trend. So yeah, the Danes are not the Dutch. Just to emphasize that. Um, uh, we we could talk about relate. We could talk about them being related to the Dutch in the sense that the Dutch are also a Germanic people. The Germans, obviously, and the Dutch and the old Anglo-Saxons and the Scandinavian peoples, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish. These are the Germanic people, so that's the broader family that they are related to culturally and linguistically. So yeah, so yeah. I got him unprepared as always. Whatever. So what else do I got here on my? I'm looking down my notes, obviously. So yeah, misconception about where they come from, and in a way, there was kind of like I said, the national boundaries were different than they are today. And the identity of who's Norse, who's a Dane, it was a little foggier once upon a time. But there was also kind of a fourth group, you might say, that was associated with the Vikings called the Gates and the Gotlanders, and they also have to do with the origin of the Goths further back. Anyway, that's we're not talking about the Goths. So but yeah, like basically Eastern Sweden. Like if you were to call them nowadays, they're Swedish, but if you were to call them a Swede, you know, during the Vikings, they were like a Swede. I don't even like the Swede. Those are our enemies. And some well that was a complicated relationship too. Sometimes they were allies of the Swedes, sometimes they were enemies. They eventually got enveloped by the Swedes, but there was kind of this fourth region in eastern Sweden that was the Gates and the Gotlanders. So there's that. Yeah. Anywho, so that's a misconception. Who is a Viking? Norwegian, Swedish, Danish. They all three were Viking. I mentioned time periods. Now, so at the beginning of the Viking era, the Danes were prominent. The Danes, the Danes were the ones who took over Normandy, the northern part of France. For a while, I think it was the eastern, or no, the western part of England was so taken over by Vikings, they called it the Danelaws. And there were some Norwegians involved in these activities, but it was kind of Dane dominated. That was the first sort of, I don't know, 80-ish years of the Viking era was Dane dominated. Then during the second period, if you want to divide it into who was dominated, the second stage, the Swedes were sort of the main Vikings. The Danes started to settle down. The Swedes went east and made trade routes throughout Russia, Ukraine, all the way down into Constantinople, and had lots of trade with the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, and got a lot of money and I had to do with the establishment of Kiev and Rus, and so you've got the Danes dominating the first period of the Viking era. Then the Swedes were these massively successful traders that got really rich, and then during the third part of the Viking era, that's when the Norwegians, the Danes, and the Swedes started to settle down, started to convert to Christianity. The Norwegians kicked it up and were more active during the third, the late stage. They were kind of the last ones to convert, the last ones to settle down, and of course, famously, they were the ones who settled Iceland and discovered Greenland, discovered America, America, before hundreds of years before Columbus. So all three of these nationalities in their own way, or regions. Back then the nationalities were blurry, etc. All three of these regions in their own way played an important part in the accomplishments that we think of as the Vikings. So yeah. Three time periods, three regions you can think about them in, sort of. I think that's kind of interesting. So, what haven't we talked about yet? I'm going a little out of order and shit. Yeah, I suck, I know. Reasons for the raids. So, there's kind of this idea that they were just a bunch of barbarians, and they weren't Christians, therefore they misbehaved or whatever. But I think there were two main reasons for the raids, other than the obvious, let's get rich by taking other people's stuff. First of all, there was the moral justification for the raid, and this is related to, like I talked about, the related peoples. So the Scandinavians back in ancient times, even today, there's a lot of trade and linguistic commonality between but especially back then, even more so back then, the northern German peoples, such as the Saxons, were relatives of the ancient Scandinavians, and then people started converting to Christianity, and then I think it was what's his name, Charlemagne. He forced a bunch of people in his kingdom, and many of them were Saxons, convert to Christianity or I kill you. And there was war, and he killed a bunch of people for 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 not submitting to the religion that he wanted them to be a part of in order to cement their loyalty into his kingdom and all that. So I think this had a lot to do with the moral justification for, okay, the Christian world is our enemy because they're taking our people or people related to us. They're trying to destroy our way of life. They're trying to, destroy our gods. We need to, so fuck them. We're gonna, we're gonna mess with them now. So there was a moral justification. Now, some people have said that that maybe there's been theories that because of the land was so hard to live on, that they needed resources. There's some truth to that. However, the Viking era actually takes place during the medieval warm period. So if anything, it might have been a little easier to live, but maybe that easier to live became a double-edged sword. So it got easier to live and people had more kids, and then the population got too high to sustain this, to sustain people on this northern Arctic land, and then you gotta go somewhere. You gotta find new lands and or at least get access to more resources, so you're not just living this basic unsatisfying life. So and of course the technology of the far from being just primitive savages like they're sometimes stereotyped as. The Viking longsword was the technological marvel of the Middle Ages. The way it could go and carry a lot, but still go in relatively shallow waters, that kind of thing. So, so yeah, I think it was a convergence of all these things. They live on this harsh land, but they got too populated, and the quote unquote civilized world started to oppress them. They struck back at a time when they needed resources anyway. It all came together at a certain time, and it went down from there. The raids went down as a result of all three of those things, plus probably other factors you could name and talk about. So yeah. So what have we covered here? We talked about the time period. Talked about where Vikings are from, who they're related to, reasons for the raid. I guess the last thing I'll talk about. Try not to make this video too long. I'm already longer than I thought I was gonna get into with this stuff. So there's this kind of stereotype from like fantasy video games of like the barbarian with like me, a shirtless. Well, I'm not completely shirtless. Like the civilized people have on the full armor, and the barbarian comes in and he's just like muscle and no armor, but he's got this huge axe. In reality, the Vikings wore, unless you were like poor and just starting out, or you're trying to be sneaky on a particular type of raid, most Vikings wore chainmail and a helmet. The helmets did not have horns, although there's a little grain of truth to that because there were some religious rituals that may have been done with horned helmets. Mostly those actually preceded the Viking era, but they may have still been a thing during the Viking era to some extent, but not in battle. That was for ceremony. They generally would not have taken that into battle that we know of. Maybe some berserk to get him for inspiration. Oh, maybe the horn will, send me power from God. There could have been a wild exception, but generally, no, they didn't. They generally didn't have the horned helmets, at least not in battle. And they generally had chainmail, and they would wear like a lot of padding under the chainmail, which was a good way to do it to help soften blows. So they had decent armor that was pretty on par with and comparable to the armor that everyone else in Europe, or most most other peoples in Europe were wearing at that time. And far from having like, huge axes and everybody's got a sword, the most common Viking weapon was the spear. Just simple, versatile. Some studies have shown that you can do, maybe a spear with a shield or a two-handed spear, but you can do stuff with a spear. You can beat a guy with a sword with a spear. Like a spear is actually a better weapon, a more versatile weapon, even though it's basic, simple, cheap. So the spear was the standard weapon. That is not to say that other weapons weren't weren't around. Yeah, a fair amount of people probably would have had a sword. It was probably more a sign of status, like, oh, you've got a sword, that means you got money. Sure, they used axes. There's a particular type of axe called the Dane axe, which is decent sized, not oversized like in the fantasy games, but decent sized axe on a long polearm that could be used to get a reach advantage. They used bows and arrows. They used hammers, but even though Thor has his hammer, that really wasn't too common, but it was a thing. So yeah, that's about what I wanted to say. So what do we talk about? Gave some basic information about the Viking Age and who they're related to, when it happened, where the people were from, reason for the raids, and armor. That's what I wanted to go over. Okay, this is okay. It's probably a sloppier video, even by my standards. It's a sloppy video, but I think there's some legit info in here. So if you made it through that, thank you, and yeah, cheers. Merry Christmas again. Later on.